Ya estamos en vivo.
Ok, gracias Margarita. Muy buenas tardes a todos y todas, bienvenidos a esta nueva jornada de Diálogos de Antropología Biológica. En el día de hoy tenemos un invitado internacional. En esta ocasión nos acompaña Sam Urlacher. Y bueno, en esta oportunidad excepcionalmente vamos a tener una charla en inglés. Y debido a eso también nos va a estar ayudando en esta presentación la asistencia de Felipe Martínez, quien es director de la carrera de Antropología de la Universidad Católica y también conoce de cerca a Sam, así que van a estar ahí apoyándonos en la traducción del inglés al español, especialmente cuando hayan preguntas, así que en caso de que tengan preguntas las pueden escribir en español y cualquier problema ahí de traducción nos va a poder ayudar Felipe. Así que bueno, le damos la bienvenida a Sam, le agradecemos que haya aceptado nuestra invitación de la sociedad y bueno, le dejamos ahí a que nos pueda dar su magistral charla. Bienvenido, Sam.
I think you're mute, Sam. Unmute.
Hola, ¿es mejor?
Yes.
Ok. Listo, entonces. Perdón. Ok. Well, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, Tamara, por la introducción y por la invitación a hablar con ustedes aquí en Sociab. Es un placer enorme, ¿sí? Estuve en Santiago en marzo y tuve la oportunidad de dar una charla en Católica y lo me encantó, ¿sí? Hay tanta energía en la antropología en Chile en este momento, ¿sí? Se puede sentirla, es un momento muy genial, así que gracias a todos por permitirme ser parte de esto otra vez hoy. Gracias. Como pueden escuchar, sí, mi español es medio malo ahorita, no lo he usado mucho recientemente, entonces gracias por esta opción para dar la charla en inglés. Sí, puedo responder, como estaba diciendo, en algunas preguntas en español, no es un problema, ojalá, pero mi charla será mucho mejor en inglés. Entonces, I will switch to English now, which should hopefully sound much better on everyone's ears. I'm excited, really excited to be here and to tell you a little about my research and the work that we're doing in my lab at Baylor on the evolutionary energetics of child development and health. The plan for today will be to keep things relatively high level. I'll try to talk for only about 40 minutes, so we have plenty of time for questions. I'd like to first tell you about my lab's overall research approach, which is biocultural and is rooted in evolutionary theory and energetics. I'll then share some of our key findings in this area, findings that we like to argue at least help us understand things like human life history evolution, nutrition transition, the embodiment of lived experience, so some big themes. And then lastly, I do want to tell you a little bit about the project that we have planned here in Santiago. So many of the topics that drive my research program relate to the global obesity crisis. For Chileans, I know I don't need to say much about how bad things currently are, right? Today, there are over 2 billion people on the planet that are overweight or obese. In Chile, that's about 2/3 of adults, about 1/3 of kids. So pretty terrifying numbers. And what's even striking is that in places where this burden of overnutrition and associated chronic disease is increasing most rapidly, which is in the developing world, we also find that undernutrition continues to exist at really alarmingly high rates. So about 400 million kids today, which is about 1/4 of all children globally, experience undernutrition-related growth stunting, which means that their height for age is at least 2 standard deviations below WHO international growth standard values. It's not just that these kids are small, right? These stunted children are themselves actually more likely to become obese at some point in their lives. So this is something that's referred to as the dual or double burden of malnutrition. And really, despite decades of thinking about these two things, overnutrition on one hand, undernutrition on the other, as two really distinct problems in a very siloed manner, it's now clear that they're related. And that variation in child development actually has lifelong health consequences. So big questions, and researchers like myself argue that evolutionary energetics is one powerful framework that can help us understand this phenomenon, right? And that can help us more generally shed light on how and why human biological variation exists. So the research in my lab really lies at the intersection of a few fields, I think: human biology, behavioral ecology, and global health. And one of the principles that we work with is a ridiculously simple concept of budgeting in life history theory. So, as I think we all know, right, most of us have a limited amount of money every month that is constrained, these budgets, and we must strategically allocate that money to pay for everything we need in life, right? To pay for our housing, to pay for our food. And of course, we know that if we pay for more on one of these things, we spend more money to eat out all the time, we're going to have less money left over for our housing. We're going to need to live in a smaller place. So we inherently understand that resources are constrained and that there are these allocation trade-offs that therefore must take place. In the same manner, at the biological level, natural selection has shaped the way that humans, all other organisms, spend the primary currency of life, calories, to fuel our competing metabolic demands. So I'll use one of my favorite study participants from Papua New Guinea here as an example. My lab is interested in understanding patterns of human development and plasticity, but really understanding how our bodies have evolved to adaptively spend finite calories to do all of life's necessary metabolic tasks, right? To do things like pump our hearts, grow, fight off infections, play, do all of these things that we need to do to live, right? And to reproduce. And in my lab, we're really interested in identifying how these evolved pathways of energy use translate variation into childhood experiences, right? So physical and social experiences into variation in development and health. So how do these things really get under the skin and alter the way that kids use calories? And how does this energy allocation variation ultimately affect development, kids' phenotype, and their susceptibility to things like obesity throughout life? Point out that one other thing we're particularly interested in is how processes of globalization and economic development and the structural inequities that come along with that, how do those things drive this entire energetic system and ultimately generate variation in development and health? So some big questions. You might be asking, why are we focusing on kids? And I'm really talking about school-age children here. So why not infants or those in the first 1,000-day window, for example? There are a few reasons, apart from it being really fun, that I'd point out. First is evolutionarily, the very fact that kids are around at all is really strange. Right, so childhood itself, and that period roughly between weaning and general self-sufficiency, is argued by many to be a unique life stage among humans. So it's one that doesn't exist among other living apes. It first evolved in our genus Homo about 2 million years ago, and has gradually been extended since then, extending along with it the human subadult life phase. Right, so this seems to be a really unique life stage in humans. Energetically, childhood is also really interesting because it's when our daily energy requirements actually peak. So this is from a paper that a group that I'm a part of recently published in Science. And what it's showing is that using a big multinational sample, total energy expenditure, so the total number of calories that someone spends every day on everything, adjusted for body size as a function of age here, is greatest not during infancy when we're growing the fastest, right? It's not greatest during adulthood when we're reproductively active, but it's actually peaks right during childhood. So this is showing that kids of this age are spending about 50% more calories pound for pound than an adult does. So they're running really, really hot. And this was a pretty cool finding, right? Led Science magazine to have this headline, "Little kids burn so much energy, they're like a different species." Not quite that, probably, but childhood is clearly very energetically expensive, and it's evolutionarily unique. So natural selection has led to something really strange in our species with childhood. On the health side of things, lifetime metabolic patterns and health disparities also often emerge during childhood. So I picked one of many possible examples. This is from Fell's, a good longitudinal study showing that elevated blood pressure here on the y-axis among adults that have metabolic syndrome, those high blood pressures first appear when those individuals are kids, right? We could show this for many other things. So insulin sensitivity, obesity, physical activity levels, dietary habits, a bunch of other factors that first appear during childhood. So this seems to be where often metabolic trajectories become aligned for the rest of life, right? So hopefully you'd agree, childhood's really interesting and potentially a really important life stage from both the evolutionary and the epidemiological perspectives. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff to look into here. And my lab is actively working in this area. I want to give a shout out right away to the great lab that I have. I have this awesome group of students who have contributed a lot to what I'll show you today. So a set of graduate students and undergrads working actively in my lab. This includes local celebrity Marcela Pfaff, who I think many of you know. So a great group of students who contributed to everything I'm going to show you. We have ongoing research projects in my lab in several countries. These are all really collaborative projects. So not enough time to put everybody up here on the screen, but many great collaborators, colleagues, local partners, participants, definitely not doing this alone. Our approach is an integrated one where we collect data in both the field and the lab. So in the field, we're collecting lots of different kinds of data from anthropometry and biospecimen collection to unstructured interviews, which you're kind of seeing here, and diet assessment. And then in our BSL2+ wet lab at Baylor, we focus entirely on kid-friendly, minimally invasive biomarker and stable isotope approaches. I'll tell you a little bit more about those in a minute. Okay, for today, I'm going to focus most of what I'm going to talk about on our work elsewhere in South America with an indigenous population called the Shuar. So the Shuar are a group of about 50,000 individuals. They live mostly in Southeast Amazonian Ecuador. Could talk forever about them. They have a really interesting history. They're the only indigenous group known to have successfully thwarted subjugation by both the Inca and the Spanish. So as such, they had relatively little regular contact with non-indigenous Ecuadorians until Christian missionization really began in earnest in the 60s. So really interesting history. Our project with the Shuar was started with local collaborators in 2005. We now have data from over 7,000 participants. I've personally spent close to 2 years in the field with the Shuar, mostly in isolated communities where people continue to live a subsistence-based forager horticulturalist lifestyle, one that's rooted in hunting, fishing, foraging, and small-scale gardening. So mainly things like plantains and manioc, which you see here. Sadly, many of these communities are really neglected. So for some of them, the only formal education or healthcare access is what our project's able to facilitate for them. So these are definitely really challenging environments for kids. So I'll just point out that for several reasons, the Shuar are a great population to work with, to ask questions about child development and energetics. First off, there are lots of kids, and these kids love to participate in research. So TFR, a total fertility rate of 8.8, meaning that women have close to 9 children over the course of their lives. So again, lots of kids that like to participate with us. The Shuar are also pretty genetically homogeneous, which has advantages, of course, for identifying environmental effects on phenotype. And importantly, the Shuar are experiencing really highly variable economic development and integration into the national and global market economy. So you can kind of see that here by the range of households that we see with the Shuar. So there's a lot of variation therefore built into this population in environment, lifestyle, and experiences to power our analyses. Okay. Importantly, we've shown that about half of all kids experience growth stunning, and obesity is also just starting to emerge. So they're at this very critical early stage of nutrition transition in dual burden. So with all these things in mind, just want to highlight a couple big findings from our work with the Shuar for you. First is that we find evidence that energetic trade-offs with immune activity largely explain variation in Shuar growth. So immune activity is really expensive, can cost kids hundreds of calories a day, and what it appears to divert energy away from growth. So people have long recognized that severe infection and illness can be detrimental to growth, of course, but by longitudinally measuring immune biomarkers in minimally invasive finger prick blood spots, we were able to show for the first time that even really low level background levels of immune activity among kids, so these are kids that are not overtly sick, right? That immune activity is associated with trade-offs with growth. So I'm happy to tell you a lot more about this if people are interested. The big take-home implication is that, again, this habitual low-level immune activity, something that's often ignored in public health, is really energetically expensive and may be a major detriment to childhood growth globally today, and as well as throughout our human evolutionary past. So we think this is a big deal. So we'll move on from that one, which kind of we'll come back to later. And the second thing that I wanted to tell you about is what we find when we actually measure instead of just estimate Shuar energy expenditure. So with that immune stuff, we looked at some of these biomarkers of immune activity to say something about how much energy kids were investing in immune activity. We weren't actually measuring at the calorie level energy expenditure though. So we wanted to do this with the Shuar, and it turns out amazingly nobody had ever measured energy expenditure using reliable methods among children in the global south outside of urban environments, period. Seems crazy, but we've now been able to bring into our work two gold standard measures of energy expenditure. So total energy expenditure, or TEE, which I showed in a figure earlier, the total number of calories that an individual spends every day in everything, and resting energy expenditure, or REE, the amount of energy that someone spends without moving, just lying there at rest all day. So this is similar to BMR, to basal metabolic rate, that you might be familiar with. So respirometry is pretty straightforward, right? You're using, in our case, a clinical device to measure oxygen consumption, carbon dioxide production at rest. And with these measures, you can calculate the number of calories used in ATP production and basal metabolism. So yeah, we brought this out on Canoe, powered it with solar. It looks kind of scary in this photo, I realized, but kids loved it. They were lining up to do it again. They thought this was really fun. So we had really good success with this, collecting these measures for the first time in a really remote area. Doubly labeled water for total energy expenditure. It's also pretty straightforward, but maybe less familiar. So I'll walk you through it. What you do here is you begin by giving children a known dose of perfectly safe, totally harmless water, water with heavy hydrogen and oxygen isotopes. So these are isotopes that occur naturally. They're already in your body, but they're at very low numbers in quantity and enrichment. So you can easily trace them once you enrich them in the lab. So when children drink this water, the isotopes quickly reach equilibrium in the body. Over time, both those hydrogen and oxygen isotopes are lost as body water, so sweat and urine, for example. However, that oxygen is also lost as carbon dioxide production. And that's what we're really interested in, since carbon dioxide production is directly related to calories burned, right? So with both of these measures, we can easily determine exactly how much of the oxygen isotopes we introduced were lost as carbon dioxide. And we can therefore calculate the total calorie utilization in the body. So pretty straightforward. So what we're doing is we're collecting urine sample before we give children this little dose of water. We're measuring isotope concentrations in some urine samples that we collect over the following week or two. And from the differences in those slopes, those rate of decline of the isotopes, we're able to determine total energy expenditure in all metabolic tasks while kids are out and about living their everyday lives. So this is a pretty cool measure. And again, the first time it had been done with kids in a context like this, a neglected rural context. So this is what we did. I'm not showing all the other data we collected with biomarkers, anthropometry, interviews, for example, on stress and market integration, lots of other things. Before I give you all the results, just a little quick background to see if this makes sense. You know, the long-held view in health and nutrition, the way that most people continue to think about things, is that habitual total energy expenditure, again, the number of calories that someone typically spends each day, follows a simple additive model, right? So if you were to spend more energy on physical activity or immune activity, that should directly translate into more energy spent overall. So if I spend 50 more calories on physical activity than my neighbor, I should spend 50 more overall, right? This would lead us, of course, to predict that subsistence populations and populations in the human evolutionary past should be spending more calories overall than populations that are now industrialized, right? This is the basis for the argument that low energy expenditure in industrialized populations is something that's driving the global obesity epidemic. However, this model ignores evolved trade-offs and constraints. And as we predicted going into this isn't what we find when we actually measure energy expenditure instead of estimating it from equations derived from generally weird populations. So some results now. What do we find? Well, when we go out and perform that respirometry, get our resting energy expenditure data, we find that Shuar resting energy expenditure, shown here in red, is elevated dramatically compared to our US and UK references. So a Shuar kid of the same size is spending about 200 calories more per day, about 20% more, so a huge amount. Some follow-up studies, I'm not showing the data in the graphs here, but some work we've done since this has shown that that elevation is indeed associated with elevated immune activity. So that low-level immune activity is, in fact, really, really expensive for kids, costing kids a quart of 200 calories a day just while they're doing nothing. Right? We also find that, as predicted, these forager horticulturalist Shuar kids are significantly more physically active than industrialized references. We used hip-worn accelerometers to measure this. However, despite these differences in immune and physical activity, we find no population difference in the total number of calories, so TEE here, that children are spending each day. So Shuar kids, shown in red, US, UK kids, shown in blue, of similar size are spending the same total number of calories every day, despite radical differences in lifestyle, in immune activity, and as we've shown in resting energy expenditure. So this is really exciting. And with new data from urban living Shuar kids also, we actually see this amazingly consistent energy transition from subsistence to market integrating to industrialized lifeways. So gradually decreasing resting energy expenditure, again in association with reduced immune activity, but no accompanying decrease in total energy expenditure. Pretty cool. And when we look just within our Shuar sample itself, so rural and urban living kids, and we look at variation in specific lifestyle and environmental factors, so looking at chronic immune stimulation and habitual physical activity, we again find there's no detectable effect of these measures on how many calories kids spend overall every day. So rather than an additive model, what we have here is evidence for what we call a constrained one, right? It's evidence that childhood habitual total energy expenditure is constrained within a relatively narrow, evolved range, one that likely limits risk of long-term overspending and negative energy balance and starvation. So it prevents kids with biologies that evolved in contexts of limited energy availability, of course, from overspending for extended periods of time. That could be really dangerous, right? So physically and immunologically active kids in populations like the Shuar, presumably those in our evolutionary past, don't actually spend more calories, right? They just spend calories differently. That's the big point. It's not the conventional way for thinking about energy expenditure, but it is one that aligns with evolutionary theory with the idea of budgeting with the principle of energy allocation and life history trade-offs. Just want to point out, I'm showing you evidence from one study. These findings are supported by an increasing amount of studies, data from adults, from non-human animal models, murine models, and others, several different disciplines. Happy to talk to you more about the evidence that's out there. With respect to childhood evolution, development, and health, we've made several arguments for what these findings mean. And I'll give you here 3 quick takeaways. So first, standard prediction equations, like those endorsed by the WHO that use an additive approach, appear to severely miscalculate for children's TEE. So kids in challenging environments appear to spend or require many fewer calories each day than we previously thought. So again, as I was just saying, if we just estimated Shuar children's energy expenditure based on equations derived from US and other industrialized populations, we would overestimate by about 300 calories. This error could obviously impact nutrition programs in low and middle income countries. Importantly, this error also has implications for human life history evolution models, right? It suggests that we need to update our estimates for how expensive kids in the evolutionary past actually were. We need to do this to better model how things like cooperation and the childhood life stage, human life history actually evolved. So we think that this is really important. We've been miscalculating how many calories kids in challenging environments actually need. The second takeaway from this work is that it really highlights the role of these energetic trade-offs, like those involving immune activity in shaping children's growth, right? In doing this in order to balance the energy expenditure checkbook, so to speak. So one really interesting implication of this model is that trade-off should play out even in environments of energy surplus. So in other words, because total energy expenditure, the size of this circle appears to be constrained across environments, elevated immune activity or elevated physical activity, for example, may always reduce energy left available for linear growth. Might do that even when there's plenty of food around and energy balance is actually positive. So this leads to lots of questions and hypotheses. For example, can this framework also help us understand then what is typically a very, very minimal impact of nutrition supplementation programs on children's linear growth in low middle income countries? So these programs, if at all, typically improve linear growth on average by only about 20% or so of expected. So increasing energy intake, according to this model, may be pointless in some cases. An investment instead of our resources should potentially be made in reducing pathogen burden to improve growth outcomes in low and middle income countries. So this is something we're kind of continuing to pursue with our collaborators in a couple of places. Final implication of these findings that I'd like to bring up is that energy intake is more important than energy expenditure in determining long-term energy balance. This is, of course, the takeaway the media loves, right? Energy expenditure appears to be constrained. Energy intake in today's world is obviously often not. And this indicates that the global rise of obesity should owe more to changes in diet than decreases in physical or immune activity. Can this framework therefore help us understand also things like the diminishing effects of exercise on weight loss over time? So not just thinking about energy gain, but energy loss. I'd argue, yes, it can. And a growing body of research suggests that this is indeed the case. So over time, our bodies seem to adjust to the altered energetic demands of exercise to reduce spending elsewhere and bring total energy expenditure right back to where we started. So that's kind of what's being shown in this figure here. These are, tightly controlled where diet is closely monitored and managed. You see that individuals put on exercise regimes. Over time, you stop burning all those extra calories that you're supposed to be burning with exercise. So sad, I know, but this does seem to be the case. So does this mean that exercise is not important for weight management and health? No, definitely not. Keep exercising. Weight management is, of course, important through indirect effects on diet, through appetite regulation, for example. It increases lean muscle mass, which burns more calories, right? It's obviously important for cardiovascular health. So keep exercising, but don't necessarily expect that exercise will help you lose weight directly by increasing your total energy expenditure over the long term. Okay. So we're currently building on some of these, core findings that we have on child energetics to address a range of more nuanced topics. So I'd like to end today by highlighting some of these topics in our planned project here in Santiago, which currently has the overly long title of Child Development and Health with Transition from Informal Settlements to Subsidized Housing. We're doing this with a number of collaborators, but I'd like to highlight who's leading the charge here: Eduardo Unduraga, who's at Católica, Nicholas Crossley, also at Católica, Dana McCoy, who is at Harvard. We've gotten funding from a number of people. We have great local collaborator. I wish I could show you data, not quite yet. So we're still in the planning stage. We're in the process of finalizing our IRB and hoping to start data collection here in the next month or so. So hopefully I can come back in a year and share some actual data with you from this project. So I'll tell you a little bit about it. There's over 1.6 billion people globally today that live in informal settlements, right? This is a real problem. 200,000, more than 200,000 Chileans now, number that's more than doubled in the past decade and a half. Not surprisingly, informal settlements can be challenging places to grow up, right? They typically involve precarious housing conditions, inadequate water supply, poor sanitation, limited access to essential services, the list goes on. Some prior research has been done on child development and health in informal settlements, but these studies have involved essentially zero biological measures. Also, importantly, they haven't investigated how actually transitioning out of these informal settlements impacts individual children. So this is what we want to do. The community that we're going to collaborate with is in Puente Alto. It's along the Maipo. I think some people know it. We visited when I was in the country in March. So here's Eduardo Unduraga, Marcela, Javiera Vasquez, whom I think some people know, one of our local partners and one of the community leaders, in myself here, visiting. The Chilean government is going to be transitioning some families living in this community to subsidized housing in the coming years. So we're trying to set up a case control cohort study to collect data really across this transition, which would be amazing. We have two big questions going into this. How does housing transition impact child development, health, and human capital? And second, what are the mechanisms that are actually involved in these changes, in these impacts? So we're going to be collecting a wide range of data. I'm not going to show you all of that, but my lab will be focusing on a couple of things that I'll point out. First is to investigate if brain energetics are an important driver of childhood developmental plasticity. So we're going to be collecting MRI brain imaging data from hopefully 80 kids. This is with Nicholas Crossley at Católica. I'm sure everybody in here watching this is familiar with the fact that humans have evolved really big, really expensive brains, right? Our brains are massive. They've increased in size throughout the evolution of our genus. And this seems to be an important factor for why we as humans burn way more calories pound for pound than our ape relatives, right? It's assumed that this is the case. There's also reason to think that why kids, as I mentioned, burn so many calories compared to adults each day is because their brain energy use is also peaking at that time of life. So there's good evidence this is glucose uptake data, again, looking in relation to age. What you see is this spike right during childhood, right? And then a major drop. So using way more glucose, using way more energy during childhood than at other points in life. It turns out, by the way, fun fact, that even though a 5-year-old's brain is smaller than yours is as an adult, it actually burns several hundred more calories each day. So these kids' brains are apparently running really hot. Does seem to be a big reason why kids relative to adults are spending so many calories each day. So we know some of this stuff, we're kind of piecing the puzzle together. We know something about variation in timing and degree of developmental changes of the brain, yet individual and population variation in brain energetics is almost completely unexplored. We know nothing about how individual brain energy expenditure varies. We know nothing about how variation in brain energy expenditure is related to variation in total energy expenditure, to growth, to other aspects of development. So we're, for the first time in this project, hoping to bring the energetics of the brain into a whole body evolutionary energetic life history model. We're really excited about that, thinking how variation in brain energetics might drive variation in childhood development and long-term health and human capital outcomes. Really excited. The other thing that I'll point out that my lab's going to focus on in this project is also investigating if gut energetics is an important driver of childhood developmental plasticity. So this is another black box, so to speak, in human energetic studies and human evolution. Human guts are not created equal, but we treat them like they are. So I always love to use the nutrition label example. I think if I asked most of you what this 230 calories mean on a food item, you would tell me that that food item contains 230 calories. And when we eat it, we're going to get 230 calories from it, right? It's actually not necessarily true, though. Maybe that's what you'll get. This number reflects how many calories you are predicted to get out of that food item. And of course, these predictions are being made for everyone who eats this and sees this label, whether you're an adult, a kid, whether you're healthy or not, living in an industrialized population or a subsistence-based population. So all of our metabolizable energy calculations are based on largely a single set of equations that were developed from white US males in the 1920s, with very few updates since then. Again, it's neglecting variation in things like the gut microbiome and energy harvest, also variation in gut absorptive ability that appears to be very real between populations and between individuals. So we're ignoring this. We want to start addressing this in this study. So through our collaboration with MicroBar, we're going to have gut microbiome data. We're also going to be doing a sugar water test, very simple test that we can do to measure variation in gut absorptive capacity. So we're hoping to do this to really start to ask, are gut energetics important drivers of human developmental plasticity and obesity risk? And we think that we're really excited. We think we're gonna find something cool here. So my lab's working heavily in this area. I'm not showing you all the things we're doing. We have an NIH grant supporting us right now, doing a number of things. But much of this work is being led by Marcela. So if you have questions about this, definitely don't just ask me, but also reach out to her, as she's planning on collecting dissertation data in this topic, not just in Chile, but also with the Shuar. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that an evolutionary energetics approach, one that's rooted in understanding how kids' bodies have evolved to spend calories, is a really powerful framework of understanding, right? It's a framework that can transect many levels of analysis, and it's one that can help us come up with new creative hypotheses and hopefully every once in a while some practical solutions to reduce health disparities. That's the ultimate goal. So we're excited about the project here in Chile, not just for the scientific reasons, but for its potential for impact as well. We do try, of course, in all of our projects to truly help the people we work with and care so much about. But this project has unique policy implications for housing transition, and it's being set up hopefully to really make an impact. So I'm not an expert in this, and I'd love to talk to any of you with research translation experience or ideas about how we might best do this here in Chile. So please do reach out to me if you have ideas about that. With that, I think I'm right on time. I'll say thank you to all my collaborators, funders, and especially to my participants and families in all of our ongoing studies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. That was fascinating. And we have many questions, so I will copy and paste some of the questions, and I will also read them. So the first one is from Constanza Silva. Hi, Sam. Very interesting research. I wonder how microbiome changes due to modernization can interact with energy allocation during development. Have you had the chance to look into these? Thanks. In Spanish, that would say, en español eso sería, me pregunto cómo los cambios en el microbioma debido a la modernización pueden interactuar con la asignación de energía durante el desarrollo. ¿Has tenido la oportunidad de investigar esto? Gracias.
Yeah, this is a great question. We are in the process of doing this. So, we do have gut microbiome data. We haven't looked at oral microbiome, for example. But we do have gut microbiome data that we're in the process of writing up right now. We think it's the first microbiome data that's linked to doubly labeled water, energy expenditure, and respirometry measures. So this is really exciting because we see with modernization, with market integration, economic development, we do have a publication out on this already with Shuar adults, massive changes, and we're seeing this also with kids. So when you compare the more, connected market integrated Shuar individuals to those living in more rural areas, their gut microbiomes are incredibly different. Reduction in microbiome diversity and lots of things, we know are bad for health or for some chronic health issues. Massive changes. And, this has traditionally been thought of, I think, in most populations as a result of changes in diet. And our data suggests that that is for sure the case. Dietary changes have an impact, but we're also seeing that changes in pathogen exposure, pathogen burden also have a major impact on the gut microbiome composition, which is something that's been kind of ignored, but that's obviously really important for a lot of the populations that I know many people that'll be listening to this work with. So we see these big changes with modernization or economic development in relation to energy expenditure. Like I said, these are the first data, but yeah, we see some strong signals. I'll leave it at that until the paper comes out, between gut microbiome composition and both resting and total energy expenditure. So cool stuff going on here for thinking about nutrition transition. Thanks, Constanza. Great question.
Great. Also, Constanza has when you are measuring energy expenditure in Shuar children, are you testing for parasites that might impact your measurements? En español, esa pregunta de Constanza sería, además, cuando estás midiendo el gasto energético en los niños Shuar, ¿estás haciendo pruebas o testeos para parásitos que podrían afectar las mediciones?
Yes, good question again. Typically we are. So for these data I showed you, yes, we are. And we see that, again, parasite infection can have impacts on resting energy expenditure, but does not seem to have impacts on kids' overall total energy expenditure. Most of the parasite burden that Shuar kids deal with are soil transmitted helminths. So they're gut infections, chronic or repetitive gut infections. And our body's immune response to these infections is one of tolerance more than anything. That's a whole cool debate and research area that we're really interested in, the evolution of immune tolerance. But these immune responses are long-term, other words. So we have shown that the long-term immune response to parasites is detrimental to growth over the long term. Yeah, great question.
Great. Nicolás Montalva says, that's brilliant. If total energy expenditure is more or less the same, yet expenditure in physical activity and maintenance are higher. There must be saving in either growth, but also in another category.
Yep.
What is this other category? What it can be? And are intrapopulation differences in these resources allocation pattern? Are there differences in allocation? If so, are these differences related with child survival or reproduction? En español, Nicolás Montalva pregunta, si el gasto energético total es más o menos el mismo, pero el gasto en actividad física y mantenimiento son mayores, ¿deben estar ahorrando en alguna otra cosa? ¿Qué puede ser esa otra cosa? ¿Existen diferencias intrapoblacionales en estos patrones de asignación de recursos? Y si fuera así, ¿estas diferencias están relacionadas con la sobrevivencia infantil y reproducción?
More great. Thank you for catching this. This is just a fact of me trying to cram way too much into a short talk. Yes, this other category is a very interesting one. One that we're really interested in. We don't know exactly what that is. We have ideas and we've modeled out what that might be. One thing that I think could be related here is thermal regulation, which is one thing that we're not measuring in our study here and the data that I showed. There's also some interesting ideas about there actually being diurnal variation in basal energy requirements that could be playing a role here. So a few interesting things. Nicolas, please email me if you want to get more into that. Are interpopulation differences in these resource allocation patterns? Yes. So I might not have been clear by the data I put up. You know, we looked not only comparing Shuar kids to US and UK kids, and Shuar kids living in rural communities to Shuar kids living in an urban community, but we also looked at household and individual level variation in lots of different things to see if it was related to energy expenditure patterns. So again, we see those things are related to resting, but not to total energy expenditure, to keep it short. Or is that related to child survival or reproduction? Would love to know. You know, we don't have the sample size, and unfortunately, not enough kids have died, you know, that are in our sample to be able to address that. The reproduction question, that is the goal of what we're doing. Is to, you know, we measured these kids for the first time in 2016. This is a project where we have long-term lasting relationships with communities and with individuals where we go back, right, repeatedly. So the goal is to have a longitudinal sample here where we can ask questions as these kids have moved through puberty and into adulthood about long-term metabolic and other phenotypic outcomes. So I hope I can answer your question about reproduction at some point. Good question.
Yeah, the questions are really tough. I have a few more now from Constanza Silva again. So she says, Sam, the Santiago Project sounds super interesting. Are you planning to consider the exposome when assessing brain energetics during development? And then she continues, for instance, diet exposure to contaminants that might affect brain plasticity at the developmental period. En español, eso sería como, Sam, el proyecto Santiago es súper interesante. ¿Piensan considerar el exposoma al evaluar la energética, el consumo energético cerebral durante el desarrollo? Por ejemplo, dieta, exposición a contaminantes, plasticidad cerebral en este periodo de desarrollo. I have to say, I have no idea what is exposome. No sé lo que es exposoma, así que maybe you can explain that too.
Sure. Yeah. So, yeah, that word is kind of used in a few different ways. I think the social exposome which is something Mike Kobar and others have really kind of defined and are utilizing in their research. The total social experience, all those different social inputs that can potentially get under the skin, right? And it sounds like Constanza has some questions about contaminants also, and pollution and contaminants, toxins perhaps. Such a good question, Constanza. The social exposome, yes, definitely. We're doing our best to try to get a wide data set and a holistic picture, working with different people about getting different measures of kids' experiences in lots of different realms, including structural inequities and how that gets under the skin. Contaminants, sadly, no. We have some interest in my lab in doing this. There's certainly, mining, for example, going on in the Amazonas, which is leading to the leaching of toxins in drinking water. So there would be reason to do this. That could affect brain development as much as growth, of course. But right now we haven't. So we need some interested people to join the lab and help us do this for sure. Cool that you're considering the gut-brain axis. Thank you. Yeah. We think it's cool in a really understudied area too. Thanks.
And also Constanza said that considering the gut-brain axis, it's very cool. Tamara, te paso la palabra.
Gracias, Felipe.
Hay una más, perdón. I'm sorry. There is one more question. Do you have, Constanza asks, do you have any hypothesis of what you expect to find in the Santiago Project? Wow. ¿Tienes alguna idea, alguna hipótesis de lo que esperar en el proyecto de Santiago? Very good question.
We do. I mean, I certainly expect that we're going to find variation in children's brain energy expenditure. There has to be. It's just been ignored. So I would also expect, and we hypothesize, that variation is going to be related to variation in other aspects of metabolism and physiology, right? Things like growth, things like immune activity, the components of energy expenditure that brain would trade off with, right? So we're just fitting brain into our whole energy expenditure picture here. Definitely with the gut, yes, we also have ideas. Marcela will come to tell you all about this at some point when she has some data. But we think that kids like the Shuar living in low and middle income countries that experience, the chronic pathogens that I already mentioned, have gut damage that they accumulate through this, and that this gut damage is going to be related to reduced energy absorptive ability. So we think that basically Shuar kids are going to have to eat more food to get the same amount of calories out of it as kids living in the US, right? Completely ignored. And Marcela is going to be doing some really detailed analysis with bomb calorimetry and everything to get at this. So we're going to be measuring not only the energy out, energy expenditure stuff we've done in the past, and we have questions there, but also now more the energy in, get a whole picture about energy balance.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And now we'll pass on Tamara. Dale, Tami.
Gracias, Felipe. Muchas gracias, Sam, por tu presentación. La verdad es que estaremos expectantes de esos futuros resultados del proyecto de investigación en Santiago. Esto la verdad es que en nuestras charlas de antropología biológica, justamente diversificar el público. Anteriormente hemos tenido charlas de bioarqueología, ahora tenemos charlas relacionadas con crecimiento y desarrollo, particularmente interesado en el estudio que va a realizar en Chile, en la ciudad de Santiago, y esperamos que también Sam en un futuro pueda también estar quizás participando en otras charlas y nos pueda presentar un avance de sus próximos resultados, porque desde ya el público está muy interesado y con mucha curiosidad sobre su proyecto de investigación. Desde ya le reiteramos las gracias por poder asistir y presentar y aceptar nuestra invitación como Sociab. Y bueno, Ojalá que también en futuras charlas SOCHEAP también Sam pueda estar participando en caso que sea de interés, y de los socios también, por supuesto, que participen en estas charlas que se hacen hasta la fecha, todos los meses. Y bueno, también agradecerte, Felipe, a ti por nuestra traducción en inglés, español, inglés, que ayudó bastante a la charla, y por supuesto integrar el público que también estuvo ahí participando de forma online. Eso, gracias a todos, muy buenas noches y nos estaremos viendo hasta la próxima. Un abrazo. Chao, chao.